Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. My name is Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I am thrilled to have Professor Babette Bohn with us, who is the author of the book Women Artists, Their Patrons and Their Publics in Early Modern Bologna. This book won the Prose Award for Art History and Criticism from the Association of American Public Publishers in 2022 and was supported by a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And today we have Professor Bohn with us. Professor Bohn, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, because I don't have your video.
Oh. Here I am.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Nagar. Thank you for inviting me. Shall I go ahead then?
Of course, a pleasure. Yes, the screen is all yours.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I can share. Okay. So Nagar, you'll tell me if there are any problems with visibility, but I think we should be all set.
Sure. Yes, this looks beautiful to me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'll just briefly mention before I take off my title screen that the background to my text is a drawing by a woman artist from Bologna, Lavinia Fontana. So I'm not really going to talk about her today, but I'm making use of her artistry for my title slide. So anyway, happy to be here. And as my title slide suggests, my own research has largely focused on the women artists of Bologna. Although since the publication of my book on that subject in 2021, okay, not sure. Oh, here we go. Okay. Sorry, here is the cover of my book. I've continued to think about how the situation in Bologna compares with that in other Italian cities. And I currently was stimulated by a fascinating exhibition in Rome, currently at the Museo di Roma until April 5th, entitled Roma Pittrice. And it's really made me think more about some of the women artists who were active in Rome. And today I'd like to reflect on some of the differences between Bologna and Rome during the 17th century as two very diverse centers for women artists. And I'll just mention that the catalog of Roma Pittrice by Ilaria Miarelli Mariani and Raffaella Morselli with Ilaria Arcangeli is in print and available. I've been working my way through it, and it's quite interesting. So my own work suggests that a broad examination of a large group of women artists in an individual city can help us to move beyond specific information on individual artists, enabling a broader consideration of what it meant to be a woman who was a practicing artist, understood in the context of that city's culture. So what were the obstacles, advantages, finances, characteristics of patronage, and other factors that contributed to women's artistic careers in a particular city? And I should probably acknowledge up front that I know more about women artists in Bologna than I do about women artists in Rome. So I'm hoping that those of you listening today who are Roman specialists will share your insights and questions at the end of today's presentation. But first, let's briefly touch on some fundamental aspects of context for both cities as distinctively different cultural centers. Rome was obviously, here we are, a much larger city, the third largest in the Italian peninsula after Naples and Venice. And it was the site of the papal court filled with wealthy cardinals and the Pope, who were key sources of artistic patronage, as were innumerable churches and religious orders. So it's no surprise that Rome had many more painters overall than Bologna did. During the Seicento, Richard Spear has estimated that there were perhaps as many as 600 painters in Rome, twice as many, roughly, as Bologna, which, according to Raffaele Morselli's estimate, had about 300 during the 17th century. Philip Sohm has argued that Rome was the Italian city with the highest per capita rate of painters in proportion to the total population. Rome's population of painters was also more diverse than Bologna's. It had many more foreign painters, constituting perhaps as much as 47% of the total, again, according to Sohm. And I'm not really going to explore this question, but I do think it's a provocative question for those of us who study women artists, just what this large number of painters and this diversity aspect of that population, what the impact of that population was on the women artists who were practicing in the city, which strikes me as an issue that perhaps would merit further consideration. Although it too was part of the Papal States, Bologna had a much smaller population than Rome and no court. Like Rome, Bologna also had many nobles who commissioned artworks, but Bolognese artists were more dependent on patrons from a range of classes, including from the middle tier of society. The 17th century Bolognese painter Elisabetta Sirani, for example, made paintings for priests, nobles, merchants, bankers, fishmongers, goldsmiths, printmakers, painters, musicians, and both men and women. I've argued that this less centralized and more diversified artistic patronage benefited women, who often painted for non-noble patrons who were not part of an established dynastic tradition. Such collectors who formed their own collections rather than building on existing family collections may have been more open to commissioning works from women artists and also more open to accepting less conventional subjects from those artists. Almost half of Sirani's known patrons were not from the noble classes. I suspect that's probably an unprecedented situation for any successful artist, male or female. And here I'm showing two Sirani paintings. The one at right, the Penitent Magdalene, was painted for a jeweler, and the picture at left for a silk merchant. That silk merchant was Simone Tassi, a wealthy Bolognese whose inventory in 1671, first published by Raffaele Morselli, included 66 paintings, primarily works by Bolognese artists of the 16th and 17th centuries. Tassi owned 4 paintings by Elisabetta Sirani, more works than he possessed by any other artist. And he also commissioned the altarpiece that I'm showing you at left, the St. Anthony of Padua, which was made for the Bolognese Church of San Leonardo, although it's now in the Pinacoteca Nazionale of Bologna. 3 of Sirani's paintings for Tassi portrayed subjects from antiquity, which was a strong interest of the patron. And one of those pictures, her Portia, which I show you here, was the second highest valued painting in the inventory. For me, this painting, with its unconventional interpretation of an unusual subject, exemplifies the kind of creative freedom the artist evidently enjoyed with a sympathetic middle-class collector like Tassi. Wounding herself to prove her courage to her husband Brutus, Portia employs not a knife, as we long assumed her instrument was, but rather a stiletto, an embroidery tool, which cleverly references the vocation of her patron, the silk merchant. Another factor that contributed to different environments for women artists in Rome and Bologna was some of the different institutions in each city. Rome was the site of one of the oldest art academies in Europe, the Accademia di San Luca, founded in 1593, which has been extensively studied by Peter Lucart. This is very different from the situation in Bologna, where apart from smaller private academies, like that of the Carracci, there was no formal academy until the establishment of the Accademia Clementina in 1709, more than a century later. Both academies admitted some, even though the precise nature of their status remains unclear. And I think it's fair to say that the early history of women's admissions to the Accademia di San Luca is also somewhat unclear, although Dr. Lucart is giving it his full attention. So hopefully we'll know more as time goes on. The first woman admitted to the Bolognese Accademia Clementina was Rosalba Carriera, a Venetian, in 1720, before the Accademia admitted a series of local women artists. And it's striking to me that despite the strong presence of local women artists in Bologna, the Accademia Clementina chose a foreign woman for its first admission, and even she was admitted only a decade after the opening of the academy. Bologna housed the oldest university in Italy, which played a significant role in promoting the careers of several local women artists, beginning in the late Cinquecento, when Lavinia Fontana had many academic patrons, including Carlo Sigonio, a famous historian at the university. On the screen are one of Fontana's portraits of Sigonio at the right, and at left a self-portrait that portrays the artist, demonstrating her erudition from the books and small sculptures that surround her. In the 17th century, some Bolognese women, like Teresa Muratori, came from academic rather than from artistic families. Thanks to Muratori's family connections with the university, she painted this allegorical fresco honoring two of her academic ancestors, a fresco painted for the Archiginnasio, which was then part of the university. And unfortunately, this fresco, as you can see from my slide, was largely destroyed during World War II. But the composition of the fresco is preserved today in this finished preparatory study. That's one of the few drawings by Muratori that's still known. As my table shows, these 5 major Italian cities each enjoyed a different number of women artists, ranging from Naples with only 8 to Bologna with 44. Rome had many more male artists than Bologna, as I've mentioned, but at least to judge from those whose names are still known, significantly fewer women artists than Bologna. In Rome, the 29 women artists whose names are still known constituted only 5% of the 600 artists who are recorded, while in Bologna, the 44 known women artists account for about 15% of the city's total, so pretty different percentages. Of course, this is a dangerous subject to speculate about, since there are doubtless many women in both cities whose names are not currently known that may yet emerge. And I have to admit that I've felt for a long time that it's important to try to be as specific as we can in numerical terms when we're talking about women artists, but it is perilous in that more women artists are being discovered, and actually the current exhibition in Rome made me aware of 5 additional women artists who I hadn't known about when I wrote my book. Rome, of course, was the birthplace of the woman who is today the most famous woman painter of early modern Italy, Artemisia Gentileschi. But Artemisia does not seem to have founded a school of artists or enjoyed many followers, and she did not remain in Rome for most of her career. Another anomaly in Rome was the remarkable career of Plautilla Bricci, who's been studied recently by Yuri Primarosa and Consuelo Lollobrigida, among others. And she's anomalous in the sense that she was a polymath whose work included architectural design. Bologna's women artists included painters, sculptors, printmakers, disegnatrici, miniaturists, and embroiderers, but no architects, so an unusual vocation for a woman. So perhaps there's a case to be made that Rome's population of women artists was more diverse in terms of specializations than Bologna's. In both cities, however, most recorded women artists were painters, not really surprising or even gender specific, since a majority of artists, male and female, were probably painters. In Bologna, during the Seicento, there were at least 35 women painters who are recorded by name out of the 44 women artists whose names are still known. My table shows some population comparisons between these 5 important cities during the 17th century. Please note that the numbers of women artists indicated here include only artists who are still known by name, and the population estimates represent approximate median figures for each city, although those numbers obviously varied significantly during the course of the century. Of the 5 cities, as you can see, Naples had the smallest number of women artists, despite having the largest overall population. And Bologna, despite having the smallest overall population, had the largest number of women artists. Rome falls between these 2 extremes with an impressive 29 women artists from the Seicento whose names are still known. More women artists than Naples or Florence, the same number as Venice, but fewer than Bologna. So how did this happen? What factors contributed to the proliferation of women artists in one city more than another? In my opinion, one key factor to consider is how women received artistic training that enabled them to become artists. The 2 traditional, obvious paths were in the convent and within the family. In Bologna, there are relatively few monastic artists whose names are still known compared to both Florence and Rome. But the subject of family training turns out to be more complicated than we used to think. If we consider non-monastic artists in Bologna, Lavinia Fontana, born in 1552, was the daughter of a successful Bolognese painter, Prospero Fontana. And in the 17th century, Elisabetta Sirani, born in 1638, was also trained by her father, the painter Giovanni Andrea, who taught all 3 of his daughters to paint. But these 2 well-known figures are actually somewhat atypical in Bologna. Of the 6 women artists known by name in the city during the 15th and 16th centuries, only Lavinia Fontana certainly came from an artistic family. In some cases, women's teachers are unknown, as with the early 16th century Bolognese sculptor Prose de Rossi, but she came from a family of notaries, not artists. Was she perhaps an autodidact, or might she have studied with a male artist outside her family? In any case, by the mid-17th century in Bologna, it's clear that most women painters were not the daughters of painters. Very likely, they were encouraged by the inspiring successes of Fontana and Sirani, even though few of these women actually studied with either figure. As this table shows, most women painters in the 17th century, 63%, found male teachers outside their own families. Even though a small majority of painters did come from artistic families, only 11 were the daughters of painters, so less than a third. It's clear that it became fairly frequent for women to study with men who were not relatives, a significant change from the early 17th century when Antonia Pinelli was the sole woman artist, at least the only one I know, who had a male teacher outside her own family, namely Ludovico Carracci. In contrast, many prominent painters from the later 17th century had female non-relatives as their students, and often they had more than one, as with Carlo Cignani, whose studio included 3, and Giovan Josefo dal Sole, who had 2 female non-relatives as well as 2 female family members in his workshop. I argue that this change was crucial for Bolognese women artists who found more opportunities to study art, thanks to the growing social flexibility that allowed women to study with men who were not their family members. Family connections, in short, were no longer a prerequisite for artistic careers. Women artists did not always come from artistic families outside Bologna either. The first famous woman painter in Italy, the 16th century Sofonisba Anguissola of Cremona, was the daughter of a nobleman, and she was probably trained by men who were not her relatives. Irene di Spilimbergo of Venice enjoyed similar origins and training during the same century. And in the 17th century, Giovanna Garzoni, a woman painter from the Marches who worked in several Italian cities, including Venice, Florence, and Rome, where she was an Accademica at San Luca, also came from a family with no other recorded artists. She too evidently trained with male non-relatives. Even Artemisia Gentileschi, the daughter of a painter, also studied with a man who was not a family member, Agostino Tassi. As women artists became more numerous, it evidently became acceptable for them to secure artistic training in various ways, even though this seems to have been more true in some cities than in others. Some women studied with other women, but an increasing number worked with men who were not relatives. The elimination of what we've considered traditional constraints for women artists training is historically important because this more open system played a crucial role in enabling more women to become artists. In Rome, as Patrizia Cavazzini first observed some years ago, male painters did not usually teach their daughters to paint. Although there are exceptions, such as Artemisia Gentileschi and Plautilla Bricci, it strikes me that many of the women who studied with their fathers in Rome originally came from outside the city and transferred subsequently to Rome with their families. This distinction applies, for example, to the painter, printmaker, and academica Anna Maria Vaiani, born in Milan to a Florentine father and Milanese mother, and to Diana Sculturi, an engraver from Mantua. I'm showing examples of prints by each of these artists, and the etching at left by Vaiani is signed and dated 1627 and is her earliest known work. It's pretty fabulous, isn't it? I think you can see the inscription pretty clearly at the lower right. Although at least a dozen women artists working in 17th century Rome had male artists in their families, those men were more often husbands than fathers, as is true with the printmaker Elisabetta Catanea Parasole, the printmaker Girolama Cagnucci Parasole, and the painter Constanza Conodovi. In those cases, perhaps it was useful to have a wife who could assist in the family workshop. But some women painters studied exclusively with male artists outside their families, at least as far as we know, including Caterina Ginazzi, Giovanna Garzoni, and the still life painter Laura Bernasconi. So it appears that in Rome, too, it became possible for women to study with men outside their own families, even if this occurred less frequently than in Bologna, a factor that may have contributed to the lower number of women artists in Rome compared to Bologna. In my recent book on Bolognese women artists, I argue that another key factor in promoting women artists was the distinctive approach of local biographers. A central argument of my book is that women artists were more successful in Bologna than in any other Italian city because they were celebrated by early Bolognese writers in remarkable new ways. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Bolognese authors changed established formulas for female artistic biography, moving beyond the token inclusion of a single woman artist that usually characterized biographical compendia in other cities, and beyond the qualified praise that typifies most writing about women artists elsewhere in Italy. Carlo Cesare Malvasia and his successors viewed local women artists as a crucial component of Bologna's cultural identity, distinguishing their home as a city with unique claims to women's excellence in the visual arts. Such writing promoted women's successful careers, their receipt of public commissions, and the collecting of their works, facilitating easier access to professional training and marking Bologna as a city whose artistic identity was distinguished by its female practitioners. And honestly, anyone interested in women artists should treat themselves to the first page of Malvasia's biography of the Sirani, which makes very clear exactly how critical a component of his feeling about Bologna as a strong artistic center, how crucial to that view of Bologna was the role of its women artists. As Frederica Jacobs and Julia Dabbs have discussed, the traditional formula for biographies of women artists was established by Giorgio Vasari in the first edition of his Lives in 1550, which included only one female biography among its 142 artistic biographies, that of the Bolognese sculptor Properzio de' Rossi. Although his second edition of 1568 added shorter discussions of another half-dozen women, none of them received an independent treatment. As my table demonstrates, Vasari's selective approach to women artists remained typical of his successors outside Bologna. Excuse me. In 17th century Rome, Mancini, Baglione, and Passeri each included a single female biography in their biographical collections. Although Passeri, who appears here, profiled a Roman painter, Caterina Ginazzi, both Mancini and Baglione devoted their sole treatment of a woman artist to Lavinia Fontana, who was a Bolognese painter, but she lived in Rome during the last decade of her life. Since Malvasia, the principal 17th century biographer in Bologna, also profiled Fontana, we can compare these three treatments of the artist to better understand their differences in method. Both Baglione and Mancini begin their biographies by noting that Fontana was the daughter of the Bolognese painter Prospero Fontana. Mancini describes her fame as a portraitist, her marriage to another painter, and her move to Rome, concluding with what I've always felt was a pretty strange anecdote concerning the Persian ambassador who wrote a madrigal praising the portraits Fontana had made for him. It's no wonder, the poem concludes, that Fontana painted so well and so beautifully the things of this world, since she herself was so beautiful. Baglione emphasizes the artist's virtue rather than her beauty, also noting her success as a portraitist. He mentions two altarpieces for Roman churches, modestly praising one as diligent and well-colored and criticizing the other as unsuccessful. A large painting with many figures, in Baglione's view, was evidently beyond Fontana's skill. Malvasia's approach in his biography of 1678 profiles an artist who seems difficult to reconcile with the woman characterized by Mancini and Baglione. Rather than emphasizing her beauty, like Mancini, or her virtue, like Baglione, Malvasia concentrates on Fontana's artistic accomplishments. Praising her skills in design and coloring, the Bolognese biographer writes admiringly of both her portraits and her altarpieces. And I'm showing you here, obviously, an example of each type of painting by Fontana. Moreover, drawing on his extensive knowledge of Bologna, Malvasia emphasizes the artist's many eminent patrons, repeatedly observing how greatly they esteemed her and how this regard translated into love and respect, as well as, more pragmatically, high prices. Not even Anthony van Dyck or Eustace Sustermans, Malvasia claims, charged more for their portraits. This last comment seems to be the first time that a female artist was celebrated by a favorable comparison to famous male contemporaries rather than exclusively to other women. I'd like to emphasize that Malvasia's attention to both portraits and altarpieces, his high praise for her artistic skills, and his concentration on her paintings rather than on her beauty or virtue distinguish his biography from those of other writers in the period, including but not limited to Baglione and Mancini. Another key point is that Malvasia discusses more specific paintings by Fontana than either Baglione or Mancini do, providing information that's quite useful today in identifying her works. This advantage of Malvasia's specific engagement with artworks is even stronger in his biography of Elisabetta Sirani, which includes the artist's own list of almost 200 paintings produced between 1655 and 1665. This critical primary source has been invaluable in leading to the identification and dating of many of Sirani's pictures. And before I take these two images off the screen, I'll just mention that although the portrait, Fontana's portrait at the left, which I've speculated may represent a woman from the noble Bendini family, is not signed and dated. I was fascinated to see that it's included in a current exhibition that's now up at the Morgan Library, because it was once in the private collection of Belle da Costa Green, who was the fascinating first librarian and director of the Morgan Library. So talk about an interesting provenance for this picture, which is now in Washington, D.C. in the National Museum of Women in the Arts. So I was fascinated to learn that recently. So thanks in large part to Malvasia's scrupulous attention to individual works, we have many more paintings by both Fontana and Sirani that are still identifiable today, many more than any of their female contemporaries are still known in. So the formidable informational advantage of Malvasia's biographies is also reinforced by the propensity of both Fontana and Sirani to sign many of their pictures. About half of Fontana's known paintings are signed, and that's true of a whopping 70%, 70. So strikingly high percentages, particularly in Bologna, where most male artists signed their paintings only infrequently. Although some women artists, such as Artemisia Gentileschi, did sometimes sign their paintings, none of them signed as frequently as Sirani or even as frequently as Fontana, which has impacted the number of currently identifiable works. In conclusion, the factors that I've touched on today, the impact of Bologna's university, the distinctive approach of its local biographers, the openness of Bolognese male painters to training women who were not family members, and the frequent signatures of women artists, including but not limited to Sirani and Fontana, all contributed significantly to the success of Bolognese women and to our knowledge of their accomplishments. Conversely, in Rome, the evident prejudices of local biographers about the limits of female artistic skill, their apparently limited interest in profiling women artists, and the overwhelming success of many male artists and institutions may often have undermined women's success in the city. We know more Bolognese artists by name, and more of them are still known in identifiable works than is true for any other Italian city of the 17th century, even though I'm sure there's quite a bit still left for future scholars to discover. I, for one, would love to know more about women's professional training, not just who their teachers were, but exactly what they were and were not allowed to do. It seems unlikely that women artists during the 16th and 17th centuries would have been permitted to draw the male nude from life, for example. But as I've argued elsewhere, in Venice by the early 18th century, Julia Lama may have been doing just that is, drawing male nudes from life. And if this hypothesis about Lama holds up, it raises questions about yet another traditional assumption we've made about women artists and their alleged limitations. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bohn, for this enlightening presentation. I truly enjoyed that, especially because this is one of my very favorite topics in art history. So with this conclusion, we're now open to questions while we still have Professor Bohn for the next 18 minutes. But if you don't mind, I'm going to start with my own questions.
Sure.
Great. You just concluded actually on one of the most traditional assumptions, as you phrased that. And one is that female artists of the early modern period did not have access to live models. And for that, some of them shifted to non-figural representations, botanical, other subject matters, and some of them we're referring to painting treatises and things like that. How do you think that your book and your scholarship can, educate us in having a more clear and realistic view of their access in Bologna and in other cities? But I'm assuming that we're going to start with Bologna, if that's okay.
So, sorry, do you mean their access to
live models?
Live models.
Especially male models.
It is a great question. It really is an important question, I think, for the study of women artists. And it's certainly clear that the beginning of women using live models must have started a lot earlier than, we used to assume not until virtually later in the 19th century, which turns out not to be true at all. And there are scholars who work on French artists, women artists, who have come to the same conclusions. So it's not even just limited to Italy that we need to reconsider this. In Bologna, Lavinia Fontana turns out, I think quite surprisingly, to have portrayed salacious subjects with female nudes. So she at least may have been drawing female nudes from life. I mean, again, there's one drawing which I illustrated in my book because I just couldn't resist putting it into the record. It had previously been published only in an auction catalog. And I mean, I think it's a drawing of a female nude. It very likely was drawn from an artistic model rather than a living model. And that was definitely something that women often did. That is, turn to art when they couldn't use living models. But the question of male models, I think the key is you can't make assumptions that what we were all led to believe. I mean, you have to really dig in. And it's difficult with women artists because we don't always have enough evidence to make the allegations or draw the conclusions that we all would really like to come to. And you still have to hypothesize. I remember when I was in graduate school, one of my professors said, don't expect to have a full deck of cards from this period, Babette. You're just not going to have everything, and you still have to come up with a working hypothesis. And I think that's really important for those of us who work in this period, women artists or male artists to varying degrees. But it's, I think on a case-by-case basis, if I look, say, at the treatment of the male figure by women artists like, say, Elisabetta Sirani, I don't see convincing evidence that she ever worked from a male model, just based on the naturalism and the amount of detail in her male figures. I believe Adelina Modesti in her 2014 monograph on Sirani suggested that one drawing attributed to Sirani might have been drawn from life. So these things are debatable, in other words, and maybe they always will be, unless we can find a letter from Giovanni Andrea Sirani to his friend Malvasia. I was really shocked to see that you're letting your daughters draw from this life. I mean, that would be awesome. But in the absence of something like that, you just kind of have to extrapolate from the visual evidence.
Right. Yeah, that would have been a dream of every art historian who works on this period. Yeah, that kind of golden document. So we have one question in the Q&A box. Hello, Dr. Bohn. This is by Margaret. Thank you for this fantastic talk. I second that. I wanted to know if you have any thoughts about women artists who may have worked in cities like Bologna and Rome, who never had their work recorded by the traditional archive. Is this something you see as possible or have any thoughts about discovering?
Yeah, another wonderful question. Thank you for that, Margaret. So I talk about this a little bit in my book, that when you work on women artists, there is no traditional archive approach, really. I mean, there are very few artworks, even by major figures like Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Sirani, for which we have conventional documentation, that is a commission signed by the artist and the patron. And, you know, I mean, for Sirani, we have one, for Lavinia Fontana, a couple, and she was a woman, so it wasn't even signed by her, it was signed by her husband. Women are often known from less conventional sources. And when I was doing research for my book, I got much more information from inventories, for example, which don't identify works by all the women artists I know of by name in this period. But 17th and 18th century Bolognese inventories do identify a number of works, and occasionally by women artists that are completely unknown from any other source. I think that's happened with the Roman record, actually, as well, with one or two women artists. So inventories are a great source of information. Many inventories are readily accessible now through the Getty Art Provenance Index, so you can access some online, or you can go to the Archivio di Stato of the city of your choice and dig in and have at it and see what you can come up with. Things like wills and marriage contracts and information about dowries. I mean, all of these are really important sources. Letters, if you're lucky enough to land on them. I mean, you have to try for archival information. One of the things I felt was most important as a contribution in my book was that I was able to find documentation nailing down the birth and sometimes death dates of some of the women artists of Bologna. And I had 68 altogether in the end, from all centuries through the end of the 18th. And the thing that means is that we were misled by the 18th century writers who were sort of fast and loose about which women artists actually studied with Sirani, for example, in the 17th century. And it turns out the short answer is that most of them would have been too young, or in a couple of cases, not even born yet. So that would have been challenging, right? But you can't verify that and it sounds very boring to nail down the birth or death date of a woman, but the next time you read something on a woman artist, notice how many of their birth or death dates are circa, as opposed to a firm date, which means a documented date. Even major figures like Artemisia Gentileschi, we don't have documentation for her actual date of death. So in the absence of concrete information about the lifespan of an artist, you're at a real disadvantage. And you kind of have to take what you get and be experimental about searching for things in unconventional places. And if you're really lucky, you can work on women artists who signed their artworks, because there are a few women in Bologna and in Rome who signed at least one work, and that's the only reason we know about them, if they weren't treated by one of the early biographers.
Great, thank you. The next question is by Janice Bell. A bit about Rome. The 2011 volume on the census in Rome between 1600 and 1630 by Rosella Baudret, I recall, identified over 1,000 artists. I'm not familiar with the study by Somme. I'm sorry, I just disconnected, and would appreciate the citation. I don't know if there is enough information on women in Milan. In the 1600s, the city was huge, over 130,000 inhabitants, 60,000 of which died in the plague. But in the late 1500s, there were many women artisans working in fabrics and other media, as Milan was a European center of production. So do you have any comments or responses to this?
Thank you for that information, Janice. That is really fascinating. Both Spear's numbers and Philip Soames' comments come from their book called Painting for Profit, The Economic Lives of Painters in 17th Century Rome from, I don't know, 2010, if I'm remembering correctly. But if there were 1,000 painters in Rome, I'm definitely going to check that source. It never occurred to me that Richard Spear's estimate of 600 was on the low end of the spectrum. I have noticed, I'm not a Roman specialist, but I have noticed that there are a lot of different estimates about the number of painters who were active there, and I thought I was actually picking the high end of the options with Spear's 600, but I will definitely have a look at Rosella Baudret's study, and that's only through 1630, so it means well over 1,000. So that makes it even creepier for the percentage of women artists, right? Unless, maybe there are a lot more women artists who were working in Rome. And I know there's some young scholars like Ilaria Arcangeli who collaborated on the Roma pittrice project, the exhibition, and I won't give away her discoveries because they're hers to publish, but I suspect she's going to be informing all of us about a number of additional women artists in 17th century Rome. So
wonderful. That's wonderful to know. Thank you. The next is written by Professor Catherine Polisi, but on behalf of Professor Barkham. Is there any reason at all to think that perhaps Rome was also a more dangerous urban environment for female patrons or painters, to maneuver in?
Meaning more dangerous than Bologna? Probably, I mean, probably. I don't have specific information to offer about that, but if you think about the stories concerning Caravaggio and for that matter, the rape of Artemisia Gentileschi, I don't know. Elisabetta Serrani never married. She lived in her father's house. And as far as I know, aside from dying prematurely of stomach ulcers at the age of 27, nothing terrible ever happened to her. And Lavinia Fontana, on the other hand, did marry. And as far as I know, she didn't suffer either. But really, again, I feel like my information is probably too piecemeal, Bill, to answer your question thoroughly. But Rome was a bigger city. I mean, one assumes bigger cities were probably more dangerous than smaller cities, but good question, and I don't have a complete answer to it.
Thank you. The next question is by Leonie. Dear Dr. Bohn, thank you so much for contextualizing your decade-long research on women artists in Bologna with the agencies and possibilities of those in Rome. Being a researcher on this topic myself, I was wondering, what do you think is the reason for the relative absence of women? I keep getting disgruntled. Women artists in France from the 15th to 16th centuries. Do you think this is given to an eroded or unstable archive? Thank you.
Interesting question, Lenny, and I'm not sufficiently informed enough to answer the question about France. I do know that some recent scholars have been coming up with armloads of, literally, of women artists in 17th century France. And honestly, I know less about the situation earlier. I would love to know more. I don't know if anyone else in our group has further information about women in France in the 15th and 16th centuries, but honestly, I don't know much about that either.
Thank you. The next is by Peter Lockhart. Thank you for your truly enlightening talk. Could you talk about your views on the value of different forms of inquiry regarding women artists, such as Anna Banti's historically informed biography of Artemisia, Agnes Merlet's fictionalized film on Artemisia, or Saida Hartman's notion of critical fabulation? How might these alternative strategies add or not to the study of women artists going forward?
Gosh, what an interesting question, Peter. Thank you for that. I once got into a major argument with a good friend of mine who loved Merlet's fictionalized film on Artemisia, and I really had such problems with it. I thought it was far too focused on her sexuality. I thought that focus impeded our appreciation and understanding of her artistry. I mean, it begins with a scene, it was traumatic for me. I can't get it out of my brain, but it begins with a scene of her bare-breastedly trying to draw her own body from a little mirror. And for me, that framed the focus of the film, which I thought was too weighted to her sexuality and to her experience of being raped as a young woman by Agostino Tassi. Anna Banti, completely different kettle of fish. I don't know if everyone in the audience knows about the Anna Banti story, but I'll just briefly mention she was writing an art historical study of Artemisia, and her house and papers were all destroyed. This is the before the internet or anything electronic. And so she decided she wasn't going to do all the archival research and everything again, but she wrote a fictionalized biography of Artemisia that is wonderful. It's moving. It obviously is written by someone with great empathy for the artist and great understanding of the artist. And the Hartman notion of critical, golly, Peter, I'm going to have to think about that last one. I think in theory, I would say that alternative strategies to the study of women artists going forward seems like a really good idea, because there are some limitations to what we have to work with. And obviously, you work on the art of this period, you don't have full information about just about any artist. But I think the record is thinner when you work on women than it is for men. And I'm sure that there are many women artists whose names are lost to us and maybe will always be lost to us. So maybe something closer to the Anabanti approach makes a certain amount of sense. So maybe I should give up this art history thing and just write biographies of some of my women artists. It's a thought, Peter. But interesting question, Peter. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. We got very thoughtful questions tonight. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I just wanted to add that Janice Bell added some information. I don't think they were all painters. It included sculptors. So the census also included sculptors. But this is really unfortunate that we're running out of time. I know it is very late in Europe, so I don't want to keep anyone over midnight. So we have to end right now, but I have provided Professor Bohn's email. So if you have any follow-up questions or further questions, you can reach out to her, or you can reach out to me and I will forward your questions to her. She's been generous enough to share her not only research, but also her contact information. Thank you so much, Professor Bohn, for being with us tonight and sharing this enlightening research with us. You are truly a leading scholar and an author, and for younger art historians and graduate students, and for many other professors around the world, your scholarship is truly essential, and your contribution is very meaningful. So thank you so much for sharing all that with us tonight, and we hope to have you again in the future.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Please join us again next Tuesday, same time, same Zoom link, works for every week. So I'll see you again next week. Thank you and have a good night. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.